It's a great honor to have with us Dr. Jane Williams, who joins us from Cambridge, England, at St. Mellitus College, based in London, but with 4 other centers, I believe, unless there are 3 other centers and 4 total, throughout the Church of England. At St. Mellitus College, she serves as assistant dean and tutor and lecturer in systematic theology. Previously, she has taught at Trinity College, Bristol, and King's College, London. She's the author of several books, including on Easter, Christmas, Christian freedom, angels, and the face of Christ in art history, among others. She's an experienced editor and a contributing writer to the Church Times, and she's been a great promoter of theological education across the Anglican Communion. Her PhD in theology is from Cambridge, and with her husband, Rowan, the retired Archbishop of Canterbury, she has 2 children. St. Mellitus, as many of you will know, is an initiative begun in the Diocese of London that has now spread to several other campuses in the Church of England, and from the start has aimed to join together a rigorous theological education alongside placements in parish ministry settings. As I understand it, half of their time is learning spent on the job in parish placement settings, and the other half in the classroom. The degrees are guaranteed, as I understand it, by the University of Durham. So it really was a clear choice to bring Dr. Williams, both in her own right and also as a representative of an institute that is doing such innovative and great things, both in the Diocese of London and throughout the Church of England. I think you told me earlier today that you have as many as 250 students at present? 250 training for ordination in the Church of England, which is very impressive. So we're very honored to have you, and we're also paired. With Emily Wachner. Am I pronouncing that right, Emily? It's a clear pairing here with Emily Wachner at General Theological Seminary, who is the Director of Integrative Programs and a lecturer in Practical Theology. This includes, as I understand it, CPE and Field Ed, and as we'll hear about shortly, the Wisdom Year. The Wisdom Years struck me as very much like what St. Mellitus College is doing in England, except that it's during the 3rd year at GTS and is designed also, like St. Mellitus College, to be a combination of on-the-job parish training as well as classroom study and reflection. I'm not an expert on it, but we all will be after Emily explains to us the practice and the pedagogy. I'm looking very much forward to hearing it. Emily has an MDiv from Yale. Previously, she was on clergy staff at Trinity Wall Street. She first ran across my radar screen when she wrote an excellent essay for the Living Church's Covenant blog on the topic of clergy underemployment, noting that 42% at present are not employed full-time by a single employer in the Episcopal Church. 42% of Episcopal clergy are not employed full-time by a single employer, but of them, 44% wish that they were. So a large proportion of those clergy wish that they could be doing more than they are. And from this, she raised some important questions, and I'll just quote one to whet your appetite. Why are we preparing clergy, she wrote, for ordination as if they will still serve as curates? Curacies are few and far between, and seminary preparation should change accordingly. So it's my honor to welcome both of them, and first up is Dr. Jane Williams.
So I have a very distinguished button presser this evening. Jordan's going to press buttons for me. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here. Can you hear me? Next question is, can you understand me? This is the best I can do, I'm afraid, in the accent department. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the papers that we've had, seeing some of the shared experiences, some of the shared situations that we're in the Church of England and in the United States, as well as some of the differences. Jordan has basically given my paper. I don't think you really need to know much more about St. Mellitus. And anybody who sat next to me at a meal time over this few days already knows about St. Mellitus. So I will show you a few pictures just to help you stay awake. St. Mellitus we pronounce it Mellitus, because Bishop Richard Charters, the previous Bishop of London, pronounced it St. Mellitus, and if you know Bishop Richard Charters, what he does, you do. Okay? Mellitus was like Augustine, was sent over from Rome to convert the pagans in Britain. He was the second wave. He followed Augustine and looked after the kingdom of the East Saxons. He was an Archbishop of Canterbury. So as our school started, our college started in that part of the world, Bishop Richard suggested that would be a good name. And in many ways it is a good name, but nobody can pronounce it. It's pronounced in so many different ways. Anybody who's read Acts pronounces it Miletus. Anybody who's done Latin pronounces it Mellitus. So, and many people think it's a disease because it sounds... because there is a medieval disease called St. Vitus's dance. So basically, anyway, people tend to remember us even if they mispronounce us. And in Britain, St. Mellitus is often credited with starting or at least popularising a new form of ordination training, which is what we call full-time context-based. So that is, students spend half their time in academic study while at the same time living and working in a church context. So that's the other half of their time, but they're full-time students. It's thought of as a new model on the assumption that living together in a seminary is what has always been the model of theological education. And so the group of us who started St. Mellitus wanted to look at that and see, is that actually true? Has it always been the model? Or has theological education actually always adapted to suit particular times and to deal with particular problems? And therefore, what is the aim of theological education, which I think is part of what you're about these few days, is actually what is it that we're trying to do and what's the best way to do it? So we're aiming at that theological education is done in different ways because we have different understandings of what it's for, I suspect. And I hope I'm going to encourage a little bit of debate about that. So as the three of us who started this model sat down with a blank sheet, more or less, to say, okay, so let's pretend there's never been theological training before. How would we like to do it? And one of the things we did was to go back and do a little bit of thinking about how it has been done in the past. So if you could press a button for me, Jordan. Thank you. The earliest church, as far as we can see, one of the things that was looked for was that church leaders should be literate. Because that was a rare gift in those days. When you think about the first people receiving Paul's letters, that they would have been read to them. When you think about, I've given you a quote there from Justin Martyr, as you know, about 150 in Rome, describing how the Christian community in Rome worshipped together. He's talking about a leader who needs to be able to read the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets as long as time permits. That's an interesting description of a service, isn't it? But again, you can see that it's a necessary part of the role of a church leader to be able to read and actually draw people together. We also see that from the earliest times, people have discerned this gift. So it's not just something that anybody who's educated can do. It's a discerned gift. So, for example, you remember that Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century was dragged into the episcopate. I think many bishops often feel the same thing has happened to them. Because something about both his learning, but also his character had been discerned by the community. So that combination that we saw, we thought, okay, we need at least those two aspects of any ordination training. We need learning to enable people to access the scriptures, but we also need something discerned by the people of God. So to enable the people of God to access scriptures, but also at the same time to model for them a Christian life. Augustine therefore set up one of the first theological colleges, you might say, in his home. He had a lot of his clergy living with him, training them by example. They used to share meals together and then go out to minister together all over the Diocese of Hippo. So potential church leaders living with the bishop seems to have been one of the earliest models of training that we find. Learning both to read, to study the scriptures together, to understand them more deeply, but also learning by example how to live the Christian life soaked in the scriptures. Study and learning from a role model, key parts of this developing model that we understood. So learning that to lead a church requires discernment, requires education, requires the development of Christian character, based in a way of life, a rhythm of prayer, Bible reading, and then serving the people of God, preaching, teaching, and pastoring to them. So can you see this sort of these developing themes that are coming out? The next stage, this is a really beginner's guide, and I'm leaving out all kinds of bits of it. The next stage, where we see the real growth of a model of theological education, which you can see is quite similar, based on what was happening with Augustine, is the catechetical schools in places like Alexandria. Became really famous, for example, under Origen, but had a number of very famous leaders, masters. They're getting bigger, so it's not just one person's household anymore. But nonetheless, the idea is still that you learn from a master. You learn from somebody who is soaked in the scriptures, but also who's been discerned as a person of Christian character who can teach you how to live the Christian life. So learn the theory, but based in character. The schools looked for this gift, this calling. They looked for what you might call the charismatic gift of leadership. And they looked for people who had experience in churches, so not people who were brand new to faith, and who were willing to receive guidance and instruction in that whole packet, not just reading the scriptures and being able to teach them, but learning how to live the Christian life in a way that they would be able then to teach others, in a way that could be made attractive through their own life. So we're beginning to see this sort of centering around, at the same time, theoretical and practical lived experience. And then I think a couple of things sort of begin to change the model in various ways, one of which is what we would traditionally call the Dark Ages. And in the Dark Ages, euphemistically called, they really weren't very dark, not much darker than they are now, really. But there was, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was this great assault on what people had taken to be civilization at that time. And the church in the West very much held civilization together. And so one of the things that begins to be developed is the need to hold a Christian culture in the light of the decay all around them. Now, and the obvious way to do that was to set up Christian communities, like the monastic communities. Now, I chose that picture partly to make it clear that this is not just a learning community, or at least not learning on one level. Those monastic communities were not enclosed communities. They were communities of service to the area in which they were set. There was a definite involvement in local politics, in local government, in local education, because there was nobody else doing that apart from the church at that time, but also care of the poor and of the sick. And not all people in monasteries needed to be priests. There were some priestly callings and some callings to other kinds of service. And of course, deep in that monastic model is that combination of learning, of prayer, of eating together, and the sense that community is the best place to hold a culture. But at the same time as this monastic model begins to spread, you also get continuing what you might call episcopal schools on the Augustine of Hippo model. So, for example, Augustine of Canterbury, again, drew his clergy together around him, and they lived together and went out to minister together. And the big development, of course, in the 12th century then is... Don't look at that just yet, we'll come back to that. Thank you. And one of the big developments then in the 12th century is of course, the beginning of universities. And if the monastic model was designed to hold a Christian culture, the university model was designed to educate a clergy. And Bishop Neil reminded us yesterday that one of the root causes of the Reformation was a real dissatisfaction with the level of education among clergy, and hugely important then to get back to that first principle that we looked at, that the people who lead churches need to be able to really teach. They need to know the scriptures. They need to know the character of God well enough to explain it to others. And so this is a vital development, the development of universities, to up the theological standards. A lot of very ill-educated clergy who could hardly gabble their way through the Mass, let alone teach and advise others. But it began a slide towards a separating out of theology and practice. A slide that we thought, as we reflected on this, had done nobody any good, done theology no good, and had done church practice no good, to think that you can separate out theology and practice. And in this period, some schools of theology became notoriously theoretical, with clergy far less connected in with ministries, far less connected in with trying to teach, preach, nurture the faith, and the famous and almost certainly mythical discussion of how many angels could dance on the head of a pin is the kind of rough caricature of that kind of theology, which would not be of any particular help to people dying of the Black Death, people longing to know whether they were saved or not. And so that separation between theology and practice, again, was one of the things that we noticed as a development in theological education that we were not sure we thought had probably served its purpose. It had raised up the importance of theological education for clergy, but at a considerable cost to both clergy and church. The next experiment we saw, thank you, Jordan, was Calvin's Geneva. Has another model of theological education, possibly not one that we would want to emulate necessarily. But Calvin was partly reacting against this separation between theory and practice that had become so much taken for granted, that academic theology is not something that ordinary people need to be interested in. And so Calvin's very rigorous understanding of how you do theological education was largely based, again, around forming people's character. Teaching them the faith, yes. Enabling them to teach the faith, yes. But rigorous attention to Christian character, so as to be able to draw people, again, to the faith. I only discovered in doing some research for this paper that Archbishop Cranmer had hoped to set up ministerial schools, had hoped to set up a system of theological education in Britain, and that his plan had been to go back to Augustine of Canterbury's idea of schools based around cathedrals, based around the life of a diocese, but cooperating with the ancient universities, because of course he was a Cambridge man himself. Other things intervened, and he never got round to it. But it's interesting to see that coming back as a parallel idea, that actually you need to hold church and learning together. And so it's really at the Oxford movement in the 19th century that begins the model that we now think of as the standard model of theological education. So I've given you a picture of the medieval schools, just to check that you're awake, okay? And then that's a picture of Westcott House, which I think some of you will be familiar with. my husband taught there. We are very, very fond of it. And this 19th century formation of theological colleges, again, I think was designed to meet a particular necessity. And this is my reading of it. I always tell my students, just because I have the microphone doesn't make me right. So do feel free to think about whether you agree with this or not. But my reading of it is that what the Tractarians, what the Oxford movement in particular, was noticing was that there was a lack of understanding of priesthood in the Church of England at the time. If you read some of the great 19th century novels, what you'll see is priesthood is a sort of profession for minor gentry. You don't really need to have a priestly character. You don't really need to be terribly interested in teaching and preaching. You just need to be a good, well-meaning gentleman. You do some good, you help the poor and so on. But it's just part of the web of British society. And the Tractarian movement it deserves enormous credit for rediscovering the priestly character that is necessary for the service of the church. And so most of the theological colleges set up in Britain in the 19th century come originally from that kind of branch of the Church of England's self-understanding, the more Catholic self-understanding. Semi-monastic, based initially in Oxford and Cambridge, with this emphasis on learning, on building disciplines of communal prayer, on eating together and building priestly character. Some of the things that we've seen throughout the last couple of centuries as essential to theological education and formation for priestly ministry. In the time in college, in those days, there was not very much practical involvement because that came in curacies, which everybody did, and are still standard in the Church of England now. It's interesting to hear that they're not so much in the Episcopal Church now. So the emphasis is on learning and on building this discipline of prayer. And on the whole, these theological colleges did not have much involvement with local church during training, nor did they have much involvement with episcopal direction or episcopal vision for the church in a particular area. Partly because in the 19th century, probably lots of bishops didn't have any vision for their area, truthfully. And partly because quite a lot of the Tractarians, despite their theology, were notoriously untrusting of bishops. And this model, then, not untrusting of bishops, but this model of drawing people together to live semi-monastic lives based around community of prayer, community of study, and community meals has become what we think of as the standard. Study theology largely as an academic discipline, which you will then learn to apply later on. Learn to pray the daily offices with the support of a community, discover quite a lot about yourself as you live alongside others in community, and allow them to shape yourself and to shape each other in that kind of way. And I don't want to say for a moment that that is a bad model. I just want to say that I don't think it has done and continues to do what it set out to do. Or maybe it did do what it set out to do, which was to rediscover the essential character of priestly ministry. And then maybe we need to develop it in other kinds of ways. Now, it has to be said that all these semi-monastic theological colleges have now changed massively. So some of what St. Mellitus is trying to do is being done also in other ways of theological education. I don't want in any sense to say that everybody needs to train in our kind of way. So most theological colleges do now have much more practical component. You would be expected to be involved in a local church. Most of them are not really semi-monastic anymore because most students are married, so you actually don't live in, which makes you wonder what the point of it is, but that's another matter. So, Jordan, another PowerPoint, just do a little bit of summarising. So it seems to me that there are some constants over this period, this quick skip through the bits of theological education history that I think are interesting. education. You need to really enable people to teach and preach. You need to enable people to understand the faith in a way that enables them to communicate it. You need to teach people to pray. Because if priests aren't praying, they are a waste of space. Yes? Nobody in this room disagrees with that. Excellent. And you need to teach people that they're formed by interaction with others. So formation cannot be entirely solitary for most people. There are one or two rare souls for whom formation can be solitary, and it is their particular gift and calling. Most of us become the people that God is calling us to be by interacting with others. And we wanted to keep those in our new model of training, those constants that we saw. But we noticed there were some other things that had got sort of left by the wayside over these centuries, one of which was learning from a master, learning from somebody whose Christian character and learning was attractive and inspiring. So learning from somebody who really lived the life. We noticed that the sort of assumption that you learn how to do a job best by doing a job, that had also slightly fallen by the wayside. The assumption that only the church can teach you how to be a priest seems to have vanished. Only the people of God can teach you how to be a priest. And we noticed that this connection that pops up from time to time, the connection with the local church, with a bishop, with a diocese, with a vision for how to be church in a particular area, had also slightly fallen by the wayside in some of these instantiations of theological education. And so we thought, let's have a go at trying a different way, which was not brand new. It was being practiced already by St John's College, Nottingham, in a different kind of way, and worked out in all kinds of different ways, some of which we've heard this evening. But this St Mellitus full-time context-based training route started about 10 years ago. The three of us who started it, Graham Tomlin is now the Bishop of Kensington. It was really his brainchild. Michael Lloyd, who, having spent a number of years with us at St Mellitus, has gone back to residential theological college training, is now the principal of Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, and me. And we had all worked in traditional residential theological colleges, and we all loved them. So we were not in any sense wanting to replace them. We were just wanting to suggest that the Church of England could do with more diversity of training for different kinds of people. Because one of the things that we discerned is that, and I want to keep saying some, not all, everything I want to qualify slightly, that some people coming out of theological colleges didn't actually know how to lead a church. And they didn't know how to grow a church, they didn't know how to teach a church, and they didn't know how to love a church. And one of the things that we really wanted to rediscover was a love of the church, not a blind, uncritical love of the church, but the expectation that if God loves his church, then we should be able to do so as well. And again, you don't really learn to love people. A theoretical love is a very trying thing when you come up against the actual people that you really have to love. Yeah. And as I say, I want to say that's obviously not everybody coming out of theological colleges, but we began to see there was a little bit of a prevailing pattern. From my own experience, from feedback from the students that I taught over 10 very happy years of teaching in a residential theological college, some of the things that got fed back to me by some of the students, remember, I keep wanting to say some, were things that arose fairly regularly, the feedback that I got fairly regularly from this small core of students. They said that actually, although the theological college put such a huge emphasis on the importance of learning to pray and that communal prayer, once they got out on their own, without the college community there to pray with them, they found it hard to sustain. So they knew they were meant to do it, and they'd been shown the model, but they'd been shown a model that worked because you were all together. And some of them found it really hard to sustain that without the community, and to sustain it throughout their ministry, a lot of the time on their own. Some of them fed back that although they'd had a really good theological grounding, once they got out into parish ministry, they found it hard to make connections between the theology they'd been taught and the theology that was required in the parish. So, for example, they could all of them tell you all the models of the atonement, but faced with somebody whose teenage child had been killed in a road accident, they didn't know how to make any helpful connections. Not all of them. Some of them fed back that having lived in this community largely of peers, a learning community, they found it difficult to relate healthily to their training incumbents and their parishioners. So they discovered some things about themselves, living in community, some really important things, but they hadn't discovered the things that only working in a parish bring out in you. And all of you who've worked in parishes will know the kind of things that ordinary people bring out of you. And some of them also discovered that they'd been made into a kind of separate priestly caste, a kind of race within the church, that they'd lost touch with a lot of their non-ordained friends, and certainly lost touch with a lot of their non-Christian friends. So that again, they went out, having been part of this group of people who had everything, who shared all the values, shared all the understanding. They then went out on their own into parishes where people had no idea what they were for. And they slightly lost their sense of what they were for as well. Now, again, you are hearing me saying this is only some. Yes, this is not universal. But it was a significantly, a small but significant minority that made us think, okay, there is room for another model of theological education alongside this. And so the model that we came up with is this full-time context-based. We want to do the academic study as rigorously as ever, because we need better theologians than ever before. Ours is not a culture that understands the Christian faith anymore. So we need people who can take the absolute best theology and make it accessible. Make it make sense to people, because it makes sense, because it's been made to make sense to them. They can actually make those connections. And so we do the academic training. They come into a centre 1 whole day a week, and they do at least 1 to 2 other days of study at home. And then they do the other half of their week in ministry, so that the study is always grounded, so that the questions they were bringing to their theological study and to their contexts were always interconnected. Why is it essential to the life and growth of the people of God to know that God is Trinity? It is, you know, it really is. It's what we're all about. But can you help people see like that? Can you still preach from the Bible when you know all the different critical resources? How do you bring a text alive when you're aware that may have been A, B, C, or D? Those are not the right letters. Bishop George, who's not here, as he was talking about, this is the only time in your life where you'll really get to know the Cappadocians. Don't waste it. And of course, I'm sorry he's not here because this is a dig at him. So, and of course, that it is essential that we understand the Cappadocians, because the Cappadocians helped us to see more about the nature of the God that we worship. Their fierce work on defining and defending the Trinity and the Holy Spirit is essential to who we are as a Christian community. And of course, their understanding of who God is made them be heavily involved in social transformation. So it's easy to forget that Basil wrote the great treatise on the Holy Spirit and built the Basilead, where the poor and the needy were cared for, and that those two seemed to him absolutely connected. And so, yes, I want people to have their rigorous academic training, and I want it always to make sense of Christian faith for others. As Jordan mentioned, our degrees are validated by the University of Durham. Most of the Church of England's theological training degrees are validated by the University of Durham. And we have probably, at St. Mellitus, probably the biggest academic faculty of any place in Britain. So certainly bigger than most universities now. Because of the strength of our student numbers, we are able to employ specialists in all the fields. The context part of the training is worked out in close discussion between the college and the diocese. So again, we're working with local contexts. And what we're looking for in a supervisor, somebody who's going to be working alongside the student in that part of their training, supported by the college. We do a lot of training of supervisors. We do visiting of supervisors. We check up that that relationship is a healthy relationship. And what we're looking for is somebody who can model that healthy, resilient, prayerful, missional ministry. So we're looking for somebody like the master of the historical model, though I'm happy to say that a lot of our supervisors are now mistresses rather than masters. We're also looking for our students to be based in a church context that is outward focused. So missional in the broadest possible sense of that. It doesn't have to be an evangelical specifically, but it has to have a sense that the church is there to transform the world around it. And we're looking for a congregation and a context supervisor who are demonstrating in their very life that they believe that the gospel is good news, that it's worth sharing in word and deed. So we're looking for confidence in the gospel. It's one of the key things that we're looking for. And so, again, we're looking for a healthy congregation as well as a healthy supervisor. Hard to find sometimes. But one of the things we've noticed is that this relationship with the college and with training potential priests is really life-giving for a lot of the supervisors. It reinvigorates their longing to be what God called them to be. It reminds them of their vision. So it seems to be a bit of a win-win at the moment. That connection with the diocese is vital for this particular vision of theological education, connecting in with the diocese, understanding of how they want to grow, what their mission strategies are, their local knowledge of clergy and churches. And it's part of that theological understanding that, again, we saw back in the early church, that the vocation of the priest is discerned by the church. I am always deeply suspicious of people who come and talk about my vocation. And are often absolutely, they go off the church completely if the church doesn't recognise their vocation. The vocation to the priesthood is one of the gifts of the Spirit, we've all said this, given for the building up of the body. And so part of what we are hoping people are learning is how to serve the church, not with civility. Serving the church sometimes means speaking the truth to it, but who expect that vocation is a gift of God to the church. Our students are not locally ordained, so it's not that they can only belong in that one context. They also very much connect in with the wider church because we're a national college. So they get to interact with students from all across the country, make friends, real friendships with ordinands in very different kinds of contexts, get a sense of what it's like to minister in a really rural area as opposed to an urban or suburban area. What's mission and ministry like in an area of high deprivation as opposed to in an area of suburban wealth? What's it like to minister in multicultural, multi-faith kind of areas? So again, one of the things that underpins our model is what we call generous orthodoxy, which is not what Brian McLaren means by it. But this sense that because we're serving the whole church in all its different traditions, we are getting a sense of what it might be to actually believe that people who worship differently, express their faith slightly differently, might also be Christians and called by God to serve his church. There's quite a large residential component. Weekends, about 2 weekends a term and 1 week a year. And again, that's vital to our sense of giving the students an understanding of the church as both national and international. We need the local context because the universal church only exists as it exists in the reality of a local church. There's no such thing as a universal church. There are only individual churches that know themselves to be God's church. But our students also need to be what the Church of England calls nationally deployable. So the Church of England has a call on them, and they might be asked to go to Newcastle or Exeter, not just say, my ministry is only here, able to go where God calls them. We give them time in these residential periods to reflect intensively on their calling, to learn from different models of prayer and worship, to think about mission, to think about leadership, to think about preaching, to think about the emphasis on character formation. And these residential periods, we teach people who are not training for ordained ministry. The residentials are for ordinands only, so we do particular ordinand-focused teaching in those residentials. And we do for other students who are called to other kinds of ministries in God's people and in God's world, we do teaching weeks where we reflect on their particular kinds of calling. I'm nearly done. You're doing really well. Let's have another picture. So we now have 4 centres. The one with the bright red pillars is our main centre in London, and this is Chelmsford Cathedral here. All of our centres are based in churches, and then, Jordan, if you can show us the next one. We also have centres in, the one on the left is St Matthias Church in Plymouth, which is our brand new centre, just started this September. That's its director, the Reverend Dr. Donna Lazenby. And we also teach in Liverpool Cathedral. That's a room in Liverpool Cathedral. All our centres are in churches, because that says something about what we think we're doing. And all of the students from all these different centres have the same pattern of teaching weekly, a day a week in their centres, and then they all come together from across the country for the residentials. So just very briefly then, a couple of our values. We want to hold theology at the heart of the church, where it belongs. God is not theoretical, and God calls a people. Theology is only possible because God calls us into relationship. We study God because God studies us. We love God because God loves us. It doesn't mean it can't be rigorous. No theologian can think of a question God hasn't heard before. So it's perfectly okay to question and probe and even to doubt, but in the context of an overall belief in God. We start all our times together in worship, and we do all our theology in that context, in the expectation that the Holy Spirit loves study as well as other kinds of things. All we do is in the presence of and for the service of God, so that we are creating a worshipping and worship-enabling people. We do all our theology in the context of mission. The gospel is good news for a world that needs to know that it's loved, sought, redeemed, transformed. And if we as church people don't believe that, then we should shut up shop. There is no point in us. So, I quote this wherever I go. It's from a letter of Evelyn Underhill to the Archbishop of Canterbury back in 1908, in which she says, God is the interesting thing about religion. And a lot of churches operate as though they think it's something else. You know, as though if you're kind enough and you have good enough socials and, you know, if the worship is really great, then you can sort of leave God out of it. But actually you can't. So unless we have church leaders and priests who really think God is the interesting thing about religion, we should all go home. And we teach, one of our core values is that we teach in the context of unity. We train people, as I say, from across the whole spectrum of Anglican traditions of worship and theology. And that's partly our Anglican calling, but it's partly our ecclesiology. There is only one God, and the people of God only have one destination. So unless we're going to get along, start to learn to get along now, we're going to have such a miserable time in heaven. And that's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? So, but also it's also part of our understanding of mission. People are different, and God can be found by different people in all their particularity. And if those people are going to be able to come to church and worship, church needs to be able to find ways of enabling them to worship in ways that are suitable for them. And if there's only one model of church, then there are always going to be people unreached. there's only one model of worship, only one model of how we speak theology, there are always going to be people who are not being reached by the gospel. We don't do lowest common denominator theology or worship. We ask we ourselves as a faculty come from the whole range of Anglican traditions, based around the confidence in the gospel and the understanding of orthodoxy, so the centrality of scripture, of creeds, of the Church of England's formularies. But apart from that, we are high, low, and everywhere in the middle. And the students likewise. We ask them to bring the richest expression of the tradition that has nurtured them and to share it as a gift for others. We find that students get to understand their own tradition better. They don't give up on their own traditions, but they suddenly realise why they love their tradition and they're able to explain it to each other. They get to love it more as they share, but they also get to appreciate other aspects of other people's traditions. And we have a large number of charismatic evangelical Anglican students. And one of the things I love is they all fall in love with sacramental theology, which makes complete sense because they expect the presence and action of the Holy Spirit transforming things. So sacraments are completely natural to charismatics. It's just they didn't know that until they encountered others who were able to show them. And we hope that what we're building then is a part of the church, an increasing part of the church, that does not want to unchurch other Christians. Wouldn't that be great? As I say, we also train other people, youth ministers, lay people studying for a variety of reasons, all of them having roots in the church, but not necessarily all of them working for the church, because actually we sometimes need to, I think we increasingly need to get lay people out of doing church jobs and doing what lay people are meant to be doing, which is disciples in the world, because they're our best missionaries. Actually, there's a limit to what clergy can do. And as I say, they come together for one main teaching week every day. We are quite keen to not to build a separate priestly caste that doesn't know how to work with lay people, that doesn't see their gift as one of the many gifts of the body of Christ. We're looking to build a church where all gifts are discerned and used. Because you might as well dream, mightn't you? What's the point of theological education if you don't dream big? So, quick summary. This is what we're aiming to do. Academic rigour, learning in context from a really inspiring liver of the life, learning to serve the mission of the church both locally and nationally, learning to pray in good times and bad, because you've learnt to pray in a community and out doing the actual job, learning to minister with others, and learning alongside spouse, partner or family, because again, families are experiencing what it is they are going to get themselves into once you're ordained, because they too are living in this context and getting the sense of what it is. We've seen a great growth. As Jordan was saying, we currently have around 250 students training for ordained ministry in the Church of England, and about 300 students, 300 other students training in theology for what the other things that God is calling them to. We find one of the unexpected spin-offs of this model really is that because people stay in their context and train, other people around them see them growing, see them practicing, and you get the sort of, well, if she can do it, I'm sure I could. So they're not taken out where nobody sees what's happening to them. People actually watch them. We also find that most of them stay and are deployed in their wider region, whereas again, if they went off to residential theological college, they often didn't go back, especially if they came from tough parts of the church. So we've seen great growth in some of the tougher parts of the church where our centres are based. A lot of our students are quite young. Significant numbers of them under 30, even more significant numbers of them under 40. A lot of them already got first degrees. They're not really attracted by the idea of going back into a university setting, you know, back to college in that sense. They want to get out and do what it is that God is calling them to. Although, as others of you have mentioned, it isn't just people with degrees that God calls. A significant number of our students come with no theological background, no educational background whatsoever. And again, because they can really shine very often in the context part of their training, that gives them the courage and the hope to do the academic part as well. And we also have an access course so that people can come for pre-theological education and get their heads around what it is to write an essay. And above all, the thing that we would be most proud of would be if we were actually helping people to believe that priesthood was about being a disciple of Christ in a way that formed your whole character. Character formation is one of the things that we're most passionate about. And we tend to believe that it is the people of God who teach their priests how to be their priests. So that's our model. I'm going to hand over to Emily to hear how we overlap, and then I think both of us would love to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Emily Walkner, the Director of Field Education and Lecturer in Practical Theology at General Seminary. I am delighted and deeply honored to be able to address you this evening, particularly following my illustrious colleague, Dr. Williams. She and I had a laugh this afternoon that over 12 years ago, I was her chauffeur in New Haven when she lectured there. It is a unique pleasure to engage in such a meaningful conversation with her and with you then this evening. So I'll get the dry part out of the way first so that we're all on the same page. And this is the description of our program, which some of you know and some of you don't. 20 hours per week in the senior year of a 3-year education, paid $20,000 for the entire year, the program year of the church, in a context with a master or mistress, a person who is an experienced theological supervisor. The time served also gives 4 credits per semester, and so the student is taking a full-time academic load at the same time as serving in a church. It sounds like we have some things very much in common. Frequently, students are taking ethics and liturgy at the same time. We don't do distance learning, and the wisdom year doesn't replace the Midler year of field education, so it follows after it, in addition to it. That's the dry part, so let's get on with it. I am the great-granddaughter of a Methodist circuit-riding lay preacher from Indiana. I discerned out of the Diocese of Missouri and spent my first few years of ministry serving in a parish there, alongside of colleagues from frontier churches. I have deep respect for the work that Don Compier and the Kemper School are doing, and also for all people who are struggling to educate and form priests for the sake of Christ's church. And yet, I stand here representing the General Theological Seminary, which I am proud to do, the oldest continuously operating seminary in the Anglican Communion. While we do not have a mountaintop, we have been equally known in past decades for holding on to the height and the distance in regards to realities that most of the church experience. We're still struggling to get out from under this reputation. The title of my talk, which Jordan chose for me, is emblematic of this historical divide: seminary and church together. What are seminary and church if not together? I believe strongly that the only purpose of theological education is for the sake of Sunday, for the health and the building up of the gathered body of Christ, for Sunday. Certainly this is a metaphor which lacks in some ways, but I think that we can all find some common ground here. Eschatologically, we believe that there will be a time in which every day will in fact be Sunday, when the church will be one and we sit in the very presence of Christ himself, and this is why we sing and we pray and we study and we sacrifice. What does this mean for us at the General Theological Seminary these days? If you've spent much time with our dean and president, Kurt Dunkel, a son of this diocese, as I understand it, you will hear Kurt say that at General we are completely focused on the growth of the church. At General we are completely focused on the growth of the church. What does this mean for General, and what does this mean for the church? I'd like to focus on 2 points: imagination and money. So let's begin with imagination, which Bishop Sumner talked about in his words, in his speech. He made the point that the purpose of theological education is to ask questions about what Christian first-order speech has to do with the world, and that it is these questions which cultivate imagination, that it is the ability to adopt a critical perspective and to question which expands imagination. 2 stories then about our students and about their imaginations. Student number 1, a young, intelligent student from the Pacific Northwest. He is the type that you would put on a development brochure. He looks good. A cradle Episcopalian, a preacher's kid. This postulant who arrived at seminary with an undergraduate degree in religion was unable to talk about Jesus. Happy to talk about Aquinas or about Augustine, but unable to talk about Jesus. Student number 2, also a native Episcopalian in his early 60s, a postulant from a semi-rural area. This student entered seminary with a huge chip on his shoulder about his age, planning to return to the church that raised him up, which had no children and was slowly dying, but he could not see that yet because it was his context. He was certain that he had very little to learn, as he had been a skilled layman his entire life. Both of these men would have been prime candidates for local training programs or for non-Episcopal seminaries closer to home. But here they were in New York, praying in our chapel, learning in our classrooms, and eating at our lunch table. Had he stayed in the Pacific Northwest, the younger student would no doubt have reified the secular culture into which he was born, even as a priest child, growing more disillusioned with the fading institutional church and with its benevolent yet seemingly powerless God. Instead, we placed the student in one of New York's most vibrant evangelical Episcopal churches, which was growing. Many of you may be familiar with it, Calvary St. George, studying with the rector, Jacob Smith. The student comes back to my classes every week, inundated by their gospel preaching and consistent focus on sin and grace, and says, I can't understand why this church is growing. What have they got that we don't? He means the Pacific Northwest, we. The answer, as he is slowly coming to know, grudgingly, is Jesus, a relationship with the incarnate and salvific God. Student number 2, the older one from a rural context, has been exposed to more than 15 healthy models of Episcopal worship and community over the past 3 years, particularly ones that include young people, and that is no accident. He has been theologically supervised by 2 excellent rectors, both of whom are female, both of whom were younger than he is. Also no accident. And in his wisdom year this year, in which he is serving 20 paid hours in a church in Connecticut, he is gaining a sense of the work that it takes to bring a church back from the brink. He realizes now that his home church is in trouble, and he is learning how much he has yet to learn. At age 62, what a thing. Neither of these men would have been changed in quite the same way if they had not separated, been formed, and entered into the liminal space which the wisdom year affords. It is a particular charism that General Seminary can offer the church. Within one short train ride, our students can and do experience a breadth and depth of worship and culture which would otherwise be unavailable to them. This charism expands students' imaginations, forms their characters, and increases their ability to question the status quo, all for the sake of the church. A second benefit that the wisdom year and field education more generally affords at General Seminary is a way to meet the increasing reality that, like it or not, many students, particularly older students, will serve in solo cures upon ordination. As I mentioned before, we've lost more than 250 assistantships and curacies over the past decade, and the finishing school model of curacy is no longer available to most seminarians, particularly not in places like Kansas and Missouri. And so, like St. Mellitus, we are investing heavily in context. ATS data, where is our ATS person? Yes. ATS data consistently reflects that the most impactful hours spent by seminarians are those spent hands-on in ministerial activity and supervision, particularly in field education. When that field experience is intensive and paid, as the wisdom year is, it not only helps the student to survive financially, but it also increases the sense of liminality, the sense that ordination is nigh, the learning both in core theological areas and in field contexts. The learning becomes urgent. I believe that the expansion of imagination is one way that we could partner with places like the Kemper School or the Diocese of Michigan, for example. We are blessed with an abundance of churches in the 5 surrounding dioceses, and we would invite students from across the church to come and to live and to study with us for a year perhaps a summer, but to join us. How might that sense of separation combined with a demanding academic load help to broaden a postulant's imagination and, in Dean Alexander's words, help them to become someone for the sake of the church? The second thing I'd like to address is the question of money. Our polity is so different from the Church of England's, and I'll admit that I'm jealous of your national model of financial support. In all of our talk about which model is the best model or the right model, what we have failed to talk openly about is that nearly all of our choices are driven by economic reality, by money. We are quick to theologize changes which have been made not because of a shift in core beliefs, but because of low balance statements. Total Common Mission, for example, was at least as much about the inability of many congregations to afford full-time leadership as it was about a renewed sense of baptismal theology, as Bishop Sumner mentioned. To take a more recent example, the rise of interim ministry as a certified clerical career path has been theologized as a calling, but is at least as much due to the reality that second career students are struggling to find full-time calls, particularly when they're not geographically mobile. In places like Kansas, I've heard whispers that lay presidency of the Eucharist is the next logical step if qualified priests cannot be found. Will this be theologized as well, once it becomes necessary? We do have an ecosystem which is fully at work, but we might not like it yet. It is an ecosystem where we have both a shortage of priests on the one hand, and also too many unemployed priests on the other. Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Nearly 25% of active age Episcopal clergy are underemployed or unemployed, and not by choice. All of these priests would prefer a more traditional full-time model of employment in one church. You may ask, especially for priests who are willing to relocate, why jobs aren't available if we are ordaining fewer and fewer priests, which we are. It is because at this time, nearly half of all clergy who are retired, who are above the age of 72, are still in active ministry. We have an artificially large supply of clergy who are extra experienced and extra cheap, often drawing a low salary and requiring no pension or medical support. When these priests leave in the next 10 years, these low-paying posts will not be sufficient to attract well-trained clergy, certainly not those who have any kind of student loan debt. That's in 10 years. And so if we have this common mission of educating and forming priests for the life of the church, for the sake of Sunday, what then do we do? 2 brief suggestions. First, we must demand better and more clear data. I know that this is a peculiar thing to suggest and not particularly sexy, but I really believe it's true. Shining a light on the unemployment, employment, and deployment trends can only help us to build up the church. We may be afraid to focus on our current ecosystem, but it is more necessary now than ever to understand it. Just one example of how far behind we are in this process. At General Convention in 2015, the Committee on Pastoral Formation suggested that we might take the radical step of getting together a map of all of the seminaries and training programs for the church just so that we know where they are. The church doesn't even know where its priests are being educated as a whole. Another example, before this talk, I emailed Matthew Price at CPG to see if he could tell me how many priests are ordained each year who have been educated outside of an accredited context. And his response is not that he didn't want to, but that this is not the data which the church currently collects. I believe that we should. We should comprehensively correlate and report on the education of our ordinands, whether they are deployed and what kind of work they are doing. And every bit of that has to do with money. Which in closing leads me to my final point, which is about sacrifice. If we are convinced that our direction is towards accessible, high-quality theological education, which leads ideally to a life of full-time compensated ministry, ideally, not always, we have to put our money where our mouth is. The House of Bishops will need to have hard conversations and to make sacrifices themselves. Seminaries will need to adapt and to partner, which we are willing and able to do. Don was right when he said this afternoon, that we are extremely competitive people by nature. But we are so much better when we are together, when we believe in and support the good faith efforts that are at work to serve our church. It is through this unity and creativity and a willingness of all to sacrifice that we will rebuild the church of Jesus Christ together. And may God bless us in our faithful attempts to do so.